Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Horror Mine. My name is Vic Shy, and this is the Scare Score, where I break down horror movies and rate them on how scary I think they are. In today's episode, I'll be going over the 2017 Indonesian horror film, Satan's Slaves. The film is written and directed by Joko Anwar and serves as a remake of the original Satan's Slaves that released back in 1980. The film tells the story of a family that is haunted by evil spirits after the death of their mother. The film follows a similar narrative to the original, exploring themes of faith, grief, and family. However, this remake does a better job in exploring these themes and is much scarier in my opinion. I'll be recapping the events that take place throughout the film while breaking down the scares and rating them on how effective they are or attempt to be. You know, the smell of death can be pretty overwhelming sometimes. Thankfully, today's sponsor Scentbird is here to help. Scentbird is a convenient subscription service that gives you access to hundreds of designer fragrances every month for just $16. Scentbird offers perfumes, colognes, and even unisex options. Scentbird offers designer brands such as Prada, Gucci, Versace, and more. If you want to explore new and different options, simply go to Scentbird's website and take a quiz which will help you find options based on your answers. With each fragrance, you'll receive a 30-day supply so you can try out fragrances before committing to a full-sized bottle, which can run you hundreds of dollars. Each fragrance comes neatly packaged inside of a small bag. The fragrance itself comes inside of a bottle that is easy and convenient to use. Simply twist the bottle like so and you're ready to smell like your best self. This month, I received 3 wonderful fragrances: 1015 by Room 1015, Stem by Malin and Guts, and my personal favorite, Cypress by Rag & Bone, which is actually pretty fitting for the horror mine. Cypress conjures the Mediterranean floral splendor of the south of France. I absolutely love the smell of cypress wood, and I was actually born in France, so this fragrance brought back lots of wonderful memories for me. Go to scentbird.com or simply click the link in the description down below and use coupon code HORRORMINE for 55% off your first month at Scentbird. That's just $7 for your first month. I'd like to give a big thank you to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. The original Satan's Slaves is considered a cult classic among horror fans. However, Joko Anwar's remake is a lot more terrifying. But how scary is it? Sit back and relax and join me as we explore Satan's Slaves and tally up the Scare Score. Our movie begins with a woman chanting in bed as a teardrop falls down the side of her face. In 1981, we meet Irini, our main character portrayed by actress Tara Basro, who starred in 2019's Empedagore, also directed by Joko Anwar. She looks over at a poster of her mother, Mawarni, who was once a popular singer. A man walks into the room and informs her that her mother's music records are no longer being sold and that there are no more royalties to be paid. We learn that her mother has been ill for 3 years and has lost her popularity. Sort of like this channel after a copyright strike in 1 month between uploads. Rini walks home and we see that she and her family live in an old house right next to, you guessed it, a cemetery. Oh joy! Rini lives with her father, grandmother, and younger brothers Tony, Bundy, and Ian, who is deaf. Due to their mother's illness, the family is struggling to stay afloat with all the medical bills. They cannot afford to put her in the hospital, so she stays home where the family can look after her. She uses a bell to call for assistance, which will obviously be utilized for a few good scares later on.
Bondi, itu kan ibu. Kenapa harus takut?
Rini tends to her mother, who frantically grabs the bell and begins shouting while looking up at the ceiling. She eventually calms down and Rini leaves the room unsure as to what the heck just happened. The camera slowly zooms into the mirror as the film's title suddenly appears on screen. The father plays one of his wife's songs, which, while catchy, has a pretty creepy vibe to it. The eldest son, Tony, comes home and tells his dad he sold his bike to help the family with money. The film does a great job in making the characters feel like a real family. Their interactions with one another feel genuine, which really helps with their characterization. Tony goes up to his mother's room to brush her hair and the window suddenly swings open. After he shuts it, he turns around and sees his mother creepily staring at him. Who knew a sick lady in bed could be so creepy? James Sunderland knew. Later that night, Rini overhears her father telling their mom to have pity on the children. While everyone is asleep, Rini hears her mother's bell ringing. This scene succeeded in making me feel uncomfortable the moment I heard the bell ring. Rini walks into her mother's bedroom and, to her surprise, sees her standing in front of the window. As she goes to touch her mother, she hears the bell ring once again and sees her real mother in bed freaking out. Rini wakes up from the nightmare and once again hears the bell ringing. I probably would have said, "Yeah, sorry mom, whatever it is gonna have to wait till morning." However, Rini is a much better child than I am and makes her way upstairs. She enters the room and, just like in her nightmare, sees her mom standing in front of the window. If I walked into that room and saw her standing after having that nightmare, it probably would have gone something like this. She walks over to her mother, but instead of turning around with a creepy smile on her face, she turns around and dies. Their mother is buried the next day, and the father meets a man named Ustad. Ustad mentions that he hasn't seen their family at the mosque, and the father tells him that they do not pray. We can see the father's absence of faith as he is the only man not wearing a songkok, a cap commonly worn by Muslim males in Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia. Ustad has recently moved into the area with his son Hendra, who takes an immediate liking to Rini. She notices that Bondi is afraid to walk away from the cemetery. He tells her about a myth that says that when the last family member to leave a funeral takes the 40th step, the dead will rise from their grave. The film does a good job in exploring the theme of grief and the family struggling with their faith. This was explored in the original 1980 version, but not as fleshed out as it is here. Joko Anwar always does a great job in making his horror movies relatable and personal. The father tells Rini and Tony that he will be going out of town to raise money so that they can afford to keep the house. Tony wonders how they can get in contact with him since the phones have been disconnected. Gee, thanks horror movie script. He tells them that they are grown-ups and that everything will be fine. That night, Bondi peeks through his window and sees someone moving in the cemetery. He initially gets spooked but then realizes that it's probably just While listening to his radio in bed, Tony hears his mother's bell ringing. As is customary for a horror movie, he leaves the comfort of his bed and walks out into the hallway. He rushes back into bed, realizing that it's the safest place to be in a horror movie, even if Juan had us thinking otherwise for years. The next day, Tony gives Bondi a Viewmaster whose real purpose is to scare the life out of him in a few minutes. While retrieving water from a well, Rini walks past a mirror with two shadows inside. The setup for this scare is a bit predictable and doesn't really stick the landing. Bondi starts playing with his Viewmaster and sees some pretty scenic views, all up until Okay, I'll be honest here. I definitely saw that one coming, and it still scared the crap out of me. It's one of those scares that you know is about to happen, but you just kinda hope it doesn't. He bravely picks it back up and looks back into it. I, on the other hand, would've. Ian plays hide-and-seek with his grandmother and uses the vibrations on the wall to find her. This is an obvious setup for a not-so-fun game of hide-and-seek later on. Also, the portrait of his mother hung up on the wall is pretty unnerving. That night, Tony tries falling asleep to his radio and it switches to his mother's song on its own. He doesn't turn it off until he again hears his mother's bell ringing. His mother begins calling his name and asks him to comb her hair. He finds her comb in his hand as she suddenly appears right next to his bed. He quickly turns on the light and she disappears. This was a great scare scene that felt very personal to Tony's character. The scene relies on the context of the story and excellent sound design to be effective. Seeing the mother haunt her own family adds that extra sense of creepiness to it all. Ian and Bondi wake up to go pee and the pair are afraid to walk back to their room because of the portrait of their mother. They approach the portrait with a white sheet and toss the sheet over it. Whoa, that really backfired, didn't it? Rini rushes into the room and we now see the sheet actually covering the portrait. We also see Grandma writing a letter seemingly out of breath. The next day, Tony brings the bell and comb to his mother's grave, hoping it will bring her peace. Irini has a conversation with Hendra where he tells her that he's been seeing an evil spirit taking the shape of her late mother. He believes that they are in great danger and offers to have them stay at his house. She declines and says she would rather wait until her father returns. He's opportunistic, I'll give him that. While she speaks with Hendra, we see grandmother at home who appears to be in distress. Irini comes home and tragically finds her dead grandma inside of the well. Smash every single television and VHS tape in that house pronto. Bondi falls into a state of shock from having witnessed his grandma's dead body. Irini finds a letter written by grandma addressed to someone named Budiman. She asks Hendra for a ride to the city so she can deliver the letter. They meet the man named Budiman, who looks like the Indonesian version of Tommy Chong. Budiman is a lifelong friend of her grandmother and has been stuck in the darkest realm of all, the friend zone. He reveals that her mother Mawarani was having a hard time getting pregnant. Irini's grandmother believed that Mawarani asked for children from Satan himself.
Jadi berdoa kepada siapa?
Iblis.
He questions the suspicious circumstances of her illness and death and believes that they may be related to her mother worshipping Satan. He gives her a magazine containing an article he wrote that may be able to help her and her family. Suddenly, a man with solid white eyes walks into the room.
Jadi pijat, Pak? Kalian silakan pulang. Saya mau pijat.
That scene made me laugh a lot harder than I probably should have. Before she leaves, he tells her that they won't be able to take any of her family members if they all love one another. Back at home, we see Bondi in bed saying he doesn't want to kill Ian. The camera pans just over his head as if something invisible is telling him to harm his brother. Irini returns home and we get to see the loving bond between the siblings, especially with the father away. With their mother gone, Irini has taken on the motherly role for her younger brothers, which is something I'm sure some of us can relate to, although Bondi looks a little odd now and a lot more possessed than usual. Now, I initially found the look on his face pretty funny until this happened. Whoa! That sure escalated quickly. Ian tries ignoring it, but Bondi gets up and stands directly above him. Ian goes into the hallway with the creepy portrait of his mother and feels knocking on the wall. He follows the knock and the ghost of his grandmother suddenly appears. He attempts to run away, but his shirt gets caught on a hook. The next morning, Rini plays her mother's song and notices something strange about the record. She peels off the label and plays it in reverse on the record player. She rushes into the boys' room and notices that Ian is now missing. Thankfully, she finds him asleep and safe inside of a container outside.
Kalau ada apa-apa, kakak pasti tolong kau. Tony juga, Bondi juga. Ya.
Tony reads Budiman's article titled Exposing the Devil Worship Fertility Cult. The article tells of a cult that helps those who are unable to have children. However, as payment, the mother must hand over her last child to the cult once the child turns 7. If we take a look at the bottom right corner of the page, we see a picture of what appears to be Darmina, the main antagonist of the original film. Tony brings up the fact that they are all 6 years apart and believes that their mother was a part of the cult but had a new child before the last one could turn 7. We also learn that Ian turns 7 years old in 3 days. Go figure. However, Ian can only be taken by the cult if he is given up by his family. This is why Budiman told Rini that they won't be able to take any of them if they all truly love one another. And by they, he was referring to
Mayat-mayat hidup.
While making breakfast in the kitchen, Grandma's wheelchair moves into the room on its own. We hear very labored breathing, an homage to Carto from the original film. Irini contacts Ustad and his son Hendra for help. Ustad wanders the house and walks into their mother's room, where a ghostly shadow briefly appears in the mirror behind him. He believes that an evil entity is imitating their late family members to tear their family apart. He says that their best option is to pray to God wholeheartedly. That night, Irini is washing her face and briefly sees the spirit of her mother. While this isn't the most unpredictable or original scare, it still brings a sense of tension and uneasiness. Rini decides to follow Ustad's advice and starts praying. It appears that she is struggling slightly as she hasn't prayed in quite some time. We then see the spirit of her mother watching her through the window. In the boys' room, Ian looks over at Bondi and sees their grandmother's ghost standing over him. The grandma herself isn't overly scary, so I'm not giving this one a ton of points. Back in Rini's room, we see that the spirit of her mother is now directly behind her. The mother's ghost looks like the typical spirit we see in every other horror movie, but is still surprisingly effective. While Rini is freaking out, the spirit creepily makes her way underneath the robe. Rini flees the house with her brothers and retreats to Ustad's residence. The next day, Tony tells Rini that the women of the cult are not impregnated by their husbands, but by the men of the cult. He believes this explains why all four of them look different from one another. Well, that's not the most ideal way to learn that information, but better late than never. Hendra receives a call from Budiman saying that he has some important information. Save us some time and tell us over the phone. Hendra vowed the first day he saw Rini that he would never allow himself to get stuck in the friend zone, so he volunteers to go see Budiman while Rini stays home with her brothers. He arrives at Budiman's, who gives him the written message and tells him something inaudible. At the same time, we see Bondi staring at Ian with a murderous gaze on his face while holding a knife behind his back. Thankfully, his murderous plan is foiled by Rini, who grabs the knife from behind him. Someone comes knocking at Budiman's door and begins trying to force their way in. On his way back with the message, his gallantry is halted when a man rushes out in front of him, which causes this to happen. The villagers arrive with Hendra's dead body to an utterly devastated Ustad. Thankfully, the script was written so that the letter would conveniently fall out of Hendra's pocket right in front of Rini, who doesn't even bother reading it. That night, she sees Hendra's spirit just outside of the house. She goes to shut the window and something aggressively pulls on her arm. Tony goes to help his sister and Ustad pulls a Dawn from 28 weeks later. She manages to break free and their father suddenly shows up to save the day. He's confused as to what's going on and why none of his kids seem to look like him. These are all important questions, folks. Rini confronts her father and asks him what he said to their mother the night she passed away. He said that while he loved her, he did not believe their children should suffer as a result of her illness. Downstairs, Tony takes Ian to the bathroom and he suddenly gets locked inside. The father breaks down the door and sees Ian being dragged into the well by a woman. The father jumps straight into the well without hesitation to rescue his son. In a scene reminiscent of Ringu 2, the father emerges with Ian in his arms. He grabs onto the rope, attempting to climb out of the well as a woman with long black hair emerges from the water. He makes it out of the well and they see the house is now surrounded by dozens of cult members with umbrellas there to claim Ian. The wheelchair wheels into the room on its own and furniture begins flying all over the place. Rini, Tony, and their father get trapped in the stairwell while Bondi stays in the living room with Ian. Bondi conveniently returns to normal and immediately goes to hide. A ghostly force grabs a hold of Ian, who calls out to Bondi for help. Bondi contemplates for a little bit, but ultimately does the right thing and saves his little brother. Good, I thought he was going to turn into Upham there for a second. The supernatural force diminishes and the family embrace one another. An enraged father grabs a knife and confronts the cult members outside of his home. The cult members remain silent and all appear to drop red seeds on the ground before leaving. The next day, the family is all packed up and ready to move out into a flat in the city. The father tells Rini and Tony that he plans on celebrating Ian's birthday tonight. This shows that while the cult attempted to claim him the previous night, he has not yet turned 7 and the debt has not been paid. Ustad pays them a visit before they leave and Rini goes out for a walk. She looks down and notices the red seeds on the ground left by the cult. Ustad apologizes for not helping the previous night, saying he's still in shock from what happened to his son. They wait the entire day, but their moving van never shows up. The electricity suddenly goes out and they bring out lanterns for light. Rini finally reads the letter from Budiman one titled Satan's Grand Plan to Spread His Seeds. She wakes up Tony and tells him about Budiman's new article. The article says that Ian is not a sacrifice for the cult, but is actually Satan's child. She says that the cult members actually came to the house the previous night to spread the seeds as a marker for the living dead to find and come claim Ian. They suddenly hear their mother's bell and hear footsteps approaching the room. They peek into the hallway and see their mother's spirit walking up the stairs. I really like the way their mother looks now. She looked pretty ghostly throughout the film, but looks even more terrifying and menacing here, especially now that we see her holding the bell. It's now Ian's turn to be the creepy kid. Bondi wakes up and sees Ian chanting in front of the window.
Lagi bicara sama teman-teman.
Ian creepily giggles his way out of the room and Bondi sees two pocong right outside of the window. A pocong is an Indonesian ghost wrapped in the shroud they were buried in. Bondi hides underneath his bed and the bedroom door opens on its own. Ustad is woken up from his sleep at the dinner table and is lured by his son's ghost. The father is fast asleep in his bed and is woken up by his wife's ghost laying right next to him. He meets up with Rini and Tony and they see that Ustad has been stabbed to death, possibly by Ian. They grab Bondi from underneath the bed and Rini sees Ian giggling his way down the stairs. Mawarni's corpse also walks down the stairs and her song begins to play. The father sees Ian outside of the house standing with all the dead. I guess that taking Ian wasn't enough as all the pocong break their way inside of the house. The wheelchair moves in front of the door and they see their grandmother's spirit going full Hodor. Proving that her spirit was attempting to help her family all along. Budiman suddenly arrives and drives the family away in his van. We get another callback to the original film as we see a pocong that strongly resembles Tommy in the background, Tommy being the original film's counterpart of Hendra. While driving away, Budiman tells them that Ian is a lost cause. 1 year later, Rini and the family have moved into an apartment downtown. One of their neighbors brings over some food and they seem to be very happy following the incident of the previous year. The neighbor walks back into her apartment and speaks to a man who says that the family must not move out. The woman says that it's time for another harvest and we see a jar full of the red seeds used by the cult. The man tells her to be patient and her name is revealed to be Darmina, the main antagonist from the original film. This is a younger version of Darmina, meaning that this film actually takes place before the events of the original. She is now portrayed by actress Asmara Abigail, who played Rati in Emperagor. For those who haven't seen the original, Darmina is an evil entity who worships Satan and preys on families that have weak faith. She uses black magic to reanimate the dead bodies of loved ones and uses them as slaves to attack their own families. We see a map in front of her with hundreds of pins marking her previous and future victims. Darmina is possibly the leader of the fertility cult and most likely orchestrated all the events throughout the film. She plans on terrorizing the family further until she can claim their souls and turn them into Satan's slaves. This will possibly be the plot of the sequel, Satan's Slaves Communion, set to release sometime this year. In the film's final scene, Darmina dances with the mysterious man, possibly her lover, as the movie ends. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Satan's Slaves. My friends, this was yet another amazing horror film from Joko Anwar. Anwar expanded on the ideas and themes introduced in the original film to create an engaging and terrifying experience. Though the film did rely on the traditional isolated haunted house formula, the scares in this film still managed to be intense and terrifying. The characters were relatable, which made their situation all the more personal and horrifying to watch. Satan's Slaves is one of the few remakes that manages to outdo the original in almost every aspect, earning an excellent scare score of 90%. The scariest scene in the film is when Tony encounters his mother's spirit while trying to fall asleep to his radio. It was a very well crafted scene that relied on context established in the story to be scary. There was no need for loud sounds or jump scares. The scene effectively combined the story itself with excellent sound design to produce a truly creepy scare. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you all for tuning in and I cannot wait to see y'all right back here in the Horror Mine. Y'all stick around. Go to scentbird.com or simply click the link in the description down below and use coupon code HORRORMINE for 55% off your first month at Scentbird. That's just $7 for your first month. I'd like to give a big thank you to Scentbird for sponsoring this video.